Hello again. I would like to cover a few more issues of creating height maps for use with the 3D designer. I'm going to start with a fractal noise as we usually do. There are of course other textures that we can use to start with. There's a new texture called gems, which would be a good one to start with, and it can create some very interesting things. Incidentally, I'll just show you briefly in the lighting tool some of the very cool things this texture will allow you to do. It's called gems for a good reason, as I'll just show you briefly. I won't try to explain any of this, but I'll just set the values quickly in here to show you what this texture actually can look like in a 3D environment, and with some pretty interesting lighting on it to boot. Let me just hit OK to that. That's just one of the textures we have. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. That actually, when you use the lighting tool, that actually creates an extra layer. So each light you have is on its own layer, which you can further manipulate. But let me merge these for now, and I'll close my sidebar for now. And I'm going to start with some fractal noise, or plasma noise as we call it here. I'm going to hit OK, and as we did before, I'm going to adjust this using the curve tool and hit OK. Now, as you remember, this will create those jagged peaks which we're so used to now. But there's more we can do with that. Say there were a jagged peak there. Well, the rain and the wind and all the weather would eventually wear down that peak, and there'd be a lot of sediment and dirt and all that kind of thing, mud, sitting down at the bottom of those peaks, just kind of laying on the ground, settled. And we're going to try to simulate that very quickly. I'm going to use the selection tool called Select by Shadows. There's shadow, midtones, and lights, which you can select. And if you select shadows, that's the darkest values, which will become selected. It's about 1/3 of the range of values, the lower third, which is being selected. And I'm going to use the Gaussian blur. And there's an interesting story. I usually call it Gaussian blur because in the old days, before the internet, all we had was old wives' tales, and to go on, there wasn't a lot of information. And the going story was that people in the old days would use gauze on their lenses to create a blurry effect, so they called it Gaussian blur. But anyways, apparently it's actually named after the mathematician, was it Carl Gauss, something to that. Anyways, I'm going to use the Gaussian blur, or Gaussian if you like, to blur out these lowest 30% of the colors. And what this will do, it will spread out those lower values in a way that looks similar to erosion or sediment settling on the ground. And I'm going to hit OK to that. And I might fade that out a little bit because we do want to keep a little bit of that detail in there, but just a little bit. And I'm going to hit OK to that and clear the selection. I will quickly demonstrate that. Transform 3D Designer. And we still have those textures we had in there from our previous example. But as you can see, we have these sharp peaks, but now towards the bottom, things have started to spread out a little bit, and they're becoming a lot more interesting now. Let me cancel that, though. We're not quite done yet. I'm going to go ahead and select that shadow area again, and I'm going to add a texture to that. I'm going to go to the Windows menu, select Fill Settings, and on the Fill Settings panel, I'm going to hit Patterns. And there's a lot of little textures built in. You could always create your own by making a custom brush. Custom brushes are basically brushes that you pick up off the screen and they become a drawing tool. But I'm going to use one of the built-in ones for now. I'm going to click on this stone texture that we have. There are several stone textures in here. This has now become a pattern, but we also have to select what fill mode we want to use. There are quite a few, but plain color is usually the one that's selected by default. I'm going to use the one called pattern fill, which will basically repeat this pattern over and over again. Click on that and hit the close button for that, and I'm going to go to image, the image menu, and go to the fill, drop that down, and the first one here is fill, or Q on the keyboard will do the same thing, and I'm going to press that. And as you can see, that area we had selected, that lower 30%, has now been filled with this brush or this texture that we've had, that we've loaded. But that's too much of what we wanted to do. We actually want to fade that out by about 90% or more, because we want this just to be a little bit of a texture. We don't want it to be an object by itself. We just want it to be a hint at a texture to where you can barely see it. I got it on 243 here, and that's probably more than enough. I'm going to hit OK, and I'm also going to blur that with a simple blur under filter, blur, simple blur. And what that will do is just slightly smooth those bitmaps out a little bit, because we don't want them to be too bumpy. We just want them to be there. And since we've done this, I'm going to go into, first I'll clear the alpha, and I'm going to go into the 3D designer and see what we just did. As you can see on the ground, if I can move this out of the way, I'm on a touchpad, excuse me. As you can see on our ground, our surface of our ground has gotten a lot more interesting. It's like little rocks, or big rocks actually. You can see individual shapes and features now that you couldn't see before. And remember, we only used a very small amount of that texture. If we had used it like it was before, it would have these rocks would have been as tall as these peaks are over here, and it would have looked terrible. So we had to use a very, very small amount of that. I'm going to cancel this though and make one more enhancement to this. I'm going to go to that swap image. As you remember, we have a texture there. But first, before I go there, I'm going to use the selection tool, select by alpha and shadows again. I'm going to select that same area we had selected before that we used to fill, and then I'm going to go to the swap image, and I'm going to do that same thing. I'm going to go to image, fill, and fill that in with that same texture. And I might fade that out again, or I might do it a little bit, but this time we want to be able to see it, because this is a bitmap that we're mapping onto the 3D object. It's not an actual geometry, but it's going to be, the color values are going to be mapped onto this shape. So we do want to be able to see it very well, so I'm going to make sure it's very visible. I'm going to hit OK to that. I might also alter the colors a little bit, because we're getting off our color scheme a little bit too much there. So I might make it a little bit more orangish or brownish, somewhere along those lines. And there's more you can do there, of course, but I'm going to go ahead and hit clear that alpha channel and go back to the main image. And as you can see, since we use that same bitmap to fill, there is a direct correlation between these bumps on here and the texture that we have here. So the bumps and the textures will map together very perfectly when I go back into 3D Designer, as you can see there. And now, as you look at our ground, these features on the ground not only look a little bit bumpy, but they also have a sort of a more definition to them. They're mapping that color onto the geometry, and it's making them more realistic looking and more pronounced. And you can really tell that there's supposed to be a rock there instead of just being a generic surface. And it makes this surface look so much more realistic. So I'm going to use that. I'm going to hit OK to render that. That's applying all that anti-aliasing and everything. And it'll look pretty much like what we had originally. As we had in the previous tutorial, we were rendering out that Z buffer. That's not particularly important, so I'm going to clear that. But there we have completed from start to finish a fairly nice looking landscape or scenery. We could also animate this. We've covered that in a previous tutorial, but that's one of the very powerful things you can do with Howler 8.2 right now. And I'm going to cover a few more filters since we're on the subject. We've done everything we can do to make this look good as far as the geometry and the texturing is gone. So now the only thing we have left is to get the colors and the camera filters and that kind of thing working. So one of the nicest looking things we can do this is probably the soft contrast improvement filter under filter photographic filters. I'm going to click on that. And this tends to make the darks darker and the lights lighter, but it does it in a very soft and natural looking way. The default values are usually a little too extreme, so you might want to take the level down a little bit to where you can still actually see this. Probably less than halfway even. You might want to work with the exposure if it gets too dark. And the softness is something you can change if you need to. If it looks too weird, you can change that as well. But that's one of the cool things you can do. And it just makes it a little softer looking, a little more like it was taken with a camera. It's not a real pronounced thing. You'd hardly notice it was there. But it does make the colors a little bit more intense and that sort of thing. And speaking of colors, we could also go in and adjust the colors. But we don't want to just adjust colors all the way across this image. We want to adjust colors in a way that's more smooth and natural looking. For example, the sky would usually have a horizon that is lighter than the top of the sky up here towards the top there. So I'm going to use that, one of my favorite tools in the program, the selection fader tool. I'm going to start at the bottom, drag up to the top, and now we've made an alpha channel selection that is very it's a gradient basically, where the bottom part is the most selected and the top part is the least selected. And I'm going to adjust the value of these foreground elements using adjust and auto balance. And this will not only adjust the value, but it also white balance the part of the image based on this window or this box that you see here. If you select an object that's supposed to be in this, supposed to be white in this object, it will adjust the rest of the image to accommodate that, or to make it look like there is white in the in the image. It'll adjust all the other colors accordingly. And a lot of times you can get a very good result from this. Sometimes you can't, but a lot of times you can. So I'm going to leave it right there. Hit OK to that. Sometimes you don't get what you want, so you can fade it out somewhere in between. I think about halfway in between is working for me right there. I might also go ahead and manually adjust the colors here to get it a little closer to what I want. I'm going to go back to the multiply mode there. Just bring the red up a tiny bit more. I want the foreground to stand out more than the background. One way to do that is to make the foreground a warmer color than the background. Common sense, but colors that are warmer tend to be in the foreground, and colors that are cooler, like blue or green or some purple maybe, can be kind of a cool color. Or maybe less saturated colors, such as grays, will be the colors that tend to look like they're further in the background. That's because our brains are accustomed to seeing things through a little bit of a ground fog or a little bit of a haze in the atmosphere, I think is why that is. But anyways, there are a lot of little adjustments like that to be aware of that are worth making. And I talked about that horizon being brighter. You can accomplish that using that selection fader, which we already have selected. I'm going to click on the horizon and drag up to the top of the screen. I'm going to hold down the shift, I think it is on the keyboard, and do the same. Start in the middle and drag down a little bit. And now we've actually selected a swath through the center of the image. Let me go to paint on alpha to just show you what we've done. Excuse me, selection, paint on alpha. as you can see, we've created this kind of unique gradient in the alpha channel where the white will be the most selected and the dark will be the least selected. I'll go back to painting normally, and anything we apply now will be just through the center part of the image. And I'm just going to change the colors of that back slightly to make them a little bit brighter, so it looks like our sky is brighter at the horizon. And I'll hit OK to that. And that was a little more than I wanted to do, so I'll fade it out by about 30%, or maybe 40, 25, I don't know. Anyways, and now that I've done that, I am feeling confident that we've done everything we can to make this image look as good as it can look. At this point in a piece of artwork, your eyes are so adjusted to looking at something that one trick you can use to get a sort of a fresh perspective or a fresh look at what your work looks like is to flip the image, or to turn it upside down perhaps. If you were working on a piece of artwork, a traditional piece of artwork on paper, you might look in a mirror, or you might turn it upside down. But here we just go to the image and flip. And as we can see, we can see the image now almost like we were seeing it for the first time. And we can see that the composition is a little bit weird. It's kind of on an angle, but I sort of like that also. I can see that the colors look good. And I can see a whole lot of things about the image that I couldn't necessarily see before. So I'm going to call this one done. And that's going to be our tutorial for today. I hope you enjoyed watching. We've covered a lot of information. We've covered texturing the ground using that fill and a bitmap image. We've covered some techniques for making the z-depth image, the height map, more interesting by using a Gaussian blur. And we've also used some filters and the alpha selection tool to help process this image to make it the best looking image we could do. So hope you enjoyed, and we'll talk to you again later.